Sunlight was just beginning to illuminate the streets of Greenwood Park, casting a soft golden glow over the trees and the winding asphalt running path. Birds filled the morning air with melodious chirps, and the fresh scent of dew wafted over the ground. For Valerie Hunt, it was her favorite time of day. Dressed in a stylish black tracksuit and with wireless headphones firmly in her ears, she paced the path at a steady pace. Her breathing remained rhythmic and calm. These morning jogs were her personal ritual, a chance to relax and collect her thoughts before a busy day. Working as head of the Internal Investigations Division of the Federal Police, Valeria was used to an unstable and demanding rhythm of life. In her 38 years, she had achieved one of the most prestigious positions in law enforcement, earning respect for her determination and dedication to fighting corruption. Her job wasn't easy. Pursuing justice meant making enemies, but she knew that the change she was fighting for was worth it. She had recently moved to the upscale Westwood neighborhood, not for status, but in search of peace and privacy. Here she could feel free, away from the noise of the city. A podcast about police reform was playing in her headphones, and Valerie was completely focused on the rhythm of her steps. But suddenly, her concentration was broken by the sound of a slow-moving car. A police patrol car was moving leisurely along the treadmill. Officer Jason Miller gripped the steering wheel tighter, his eyes narrowed. To him, a woman running in a predominantly white neighborhood looked suspicious. He'd learned in his years of service, some people just didn't belong in certain places, and he was certain this woman was up to something. Instantly putting his scenario together in his head, Miller turned on his blinkers and braked sharply, blocking the jogging path. Valeria slowed, raising an eyebrow, a slight irritation in her eyes. Taking out one earpiece, she turned to the officer. It wasn't the first time she'd been pulled over for no apparent reason, but that didn't make the situation any less unpleasant. Miller stepped out of the car, his posture radiating authority, his uniform ironed, but there was an undercurrent of menace in his gaze. "Hey, you!" he called sharply, pointing at Valeria. "What are you doing here?" She frowned, confused by his hostile tone, and gestured to her gym clothes and the water bottle attached to her belt. "Running," she replied in a steady voice, but Miller wasn't even going to listen. "Don't get smart," he snapped. "There's a report of a suspicious person matching your description, illegally in the area, possibly involved in a theft. What do you make of that?" Valeria blinked, stunned by such a blatant lie. "I'm sorry, I live here. I run on this path every morning." But the officer wasn't listening. He crossed his arms over his chest as he continued to study her with a look of distrust. "Do you have your papers on you?" he demanded. Valeria sighed heavily, holding back her irritation. "They're at home. I didn't think I'd need ID for my morning run." Miller smirked as if he'd caught her in a lie. "Convenient. You mean no proof? No ID? Do you realize what that looks like?" Meanwhile, gawkers began to gather around, some already filming what was happening on their phones. Valeria realized that the situation was quickly turning into a public spectacle. She took a deep breath and spoke in a firm but calm voice. "Officer, I'm telling you the truth. My house is 2 blocks from here. This is some kind of misunderstanding." "It's not a misunderstanding." Miller interrupted her sharply. "Look, lady, I don't have time for games. Either you cooperate or we're going to have a problem." Valeria's jaw clenched. She didn't want to escalate the situation, but she knew her rights perfectly well. "Officer, I suggest you think about your actions," she said in a quiet but firm voice. "You're making a mistake." Miller's eyes narrowed. He took her words as a challenge. "Is that a threat? You think you can intimidate me?" He reached for the handcuffs. "Hands behind your back." Valeria didn't move, her voice lowered, but it was threatening. "Officer, I'm warning you. You have no idea who you're dealing with." Her calmness only made him angrier. He grabbed her arm, trying to pin it behind her back, but she slipped out easily. The gawkers gasped. Phone cameras captured every second of what was happening. Miller froze for a moment in surprise, and then his face contorted with rage. "Resisting arrest!" he yelled, reaching for his walkie-talkie. But Valeria didn't flinch. "No, officer," she replied calmly. "This is me reminding you that you just crossed the line." Miller's face turned crimson with anger. He snapped the handcuffs on her wrists with force. "You've resisted long enough," he growled. His crude action elicited indignant cries of outrage. "Hey, she didn't do anything," shouted a man from the crowd, filming the whole thing on his cell phone. "Let her go." An elderly woman cheered him on, but Miller wasn't paying attention. He grabbed Valeria by the arm and led her to the patrol car. "You're making a scene," she said softly. "You're making a scene," he snapped at her, opening the door. Valerie got into the car with dignity, which made the officer even angrier. She looked him straight in the eye. "I warned you. You're going to regret this." Those words stuck in his head as he slammed the door noisily shut. The crowd gasped. "This is cruelty." The woman was outraged. "We have it all written down," shouted someone. But Miller ignored them. He was sure he had acted correctly. However, a slight smile flashed across Valerie's lips. A smile he didn't see, but which would later haunt him. Lena stepped out of the car, her wrists still restrained by the cold handcuffs, but her head remained proudly raised. Detective Harris, ignoring her protests and the curious looks of her coworkers, led her to the front desk. "One detainee for trespassing and resisting arrest," he announced loudly, tossing the paperwork on the desk. The clerk behind the counter began nervously filling out paperwork, and Harris was literally glowing with smugness. Lena didn't say a word. She knew what was coming next. He didn't have long to savor his triumph. Suddenly, the doors of the station rattled open, and Captain Blake swiftly entered the room. This woman knew no compromise. Her hard features and commanding posture instantly silenced everyone. She held a clipboard in one hand and a cell phone in the other. "Harris!" Her voice echoed through the room. The detective froze, his pen hovering over the documents. He turned slowly toward the captain, and the smug smile faded from his face, giving way to confusion. "Captain Blake?" he muttered, trying to keep his composure. "I was just processing." But his voice trailed off when he saw the tablet screen. The streaming video of Lena's arrest had already gone viral, spreading across the web in minutes. It clearly showed Harris's aggressive behavior as well as the protests of eyewitnesses. Captain Blake picked up a printout of the report and quoted with venomous sarcasm. "Trespassing and resisting arrest?" She threw him an icy stare. "Do you even realize who you've arrested?" Harris swallowed, glancing at Lena, who now allowed herself a slight, barely perceptible smile. "But she..." He tried to justify himself. "This is Lena Carter," the captain interrupted sharply, her voice as hard as steel. "Chief of Internal Security for the State Police Department. A moment of truth." Officer Harris felt his insides shatter. His face turned pale. He looked at Lena. His mouth opened and closed, but the words stuck in his throat. I didn't know." He barely squeezed out. "It's obvious enough," Blake interrupted him scathingly. "You've just made a fool of yourself, embarrassed this precinct, and undermined the credibility of our department. You've made every possible mistake you could have made." A storm of thoughts raced through Harris's mind. He tried to realize the magnitude of his mistake. Lena, without losing his cool, took a step forward. "I warned you that by the end of the day you'd regret it." Her voice sounded calm, but there was an unequivocal confidence in her words. Blake nodded. "We'll deal with it, Miss Carter. You can rest assured this officer will be held accountable for his actions." She threw Harris a look that made him squirm in his seat. The sense of his own untouchability he'd enjoyed just a few minutes ago was now crumbling to dust. "I demand an immediate review of all of Detective Harris's service records." Lena's voice was loud and clear again. "Every arrest, every report, every complaint ever made against him." The silence in the precinct became almost palpable. The officers glanced around nervously, and Harris froze as if petrified. "Get his personnel file immediately," the captain ordered another officer. After a few minutes, the detective's record came up on the screen, and the more information surfaced, the more the situation grew more heated. It became obvious Harris had repeatedly stopped minorities without probable cause, often resorted to the use of force, and ignored warnings from his superiors. A long list of violations left him no chance. "You didn't just violate my rights," Lena said. "You betrayed the public trust and tarnished the honor of the police force." Captain Blake stepped forward and, without hesitation, ripped the badge off his chest. "You are hereby stripped of your rank and all authority, effective immediately." Her voice sounded flat. "You are suspended without pay pending the outcome of the proceedings." The room fell into a sepulchral silence. Only the noise of the air conditioner hummed softly in the background. Harris's face flashed with color. But it's not fair," he stammered. "I didn't know who she was." Lena glanced up at him. Her expression remained calm, but hardness sparkled in her eyes. "You didn't need to know who I was," she said. "It was enough to treat me with the respect any man deserves, and you failed to do that." Meanwhile, the video of her arrest continued to spread on social media, reaching national news outlets. The headlines blazed. Racial discrimination turned against police officer. Arrest of head of internal security. Corruption exposed. Public outrage grew, and demands for reform grew louder and louder. Later that day, Lena stood in front of reporters outside the precinct, holding her head high. Captain Blake was by her side. "This isn't about one bad cop," Lena declared, her voice booming over the crowd. "It's about a system that allows people like him to go unpunished. It ends here and now. We will hold anyone who abuses their power accountable." The crowd erupted in applause. People's faith in change burst forth with renewed vigor. Harris stood back, still shaken by how quickly his world had crumbled. Months had passed, but the effects of that day were still being felt. Under Lena's leadership, a massive investigation of the local police force had begun. New cases of abuse were uncovered, several officers were held accountable, and reforms were introduced to prevent further injustices. Lena became a national figure in the fight for police accountability. Her story didn't just shock, it inspired change. And Harris was now a nobody. Stripped of his credentials and reputation, he'd struggled to find a job as a parking meter maid. The once confident officer now spent his days writing tickets. One day, walking past a cafe, he glanced at the TV in the window. The screen showed Lena receiving a prestigious award for her contribution to police reform. The auditorium erupted in applause, and her face lit up with an appreciative smile. Harris froze. His stomach clenched painfully. Memories of that day flooded into his mind. Her warnings, the screams of eyewitnesses, his own self-assurance. Deep inside, a bitter regret was brewing. He knew he had only himself to blame.